We are part of one civilization, Western civilization. We are bound to one another by the deepest bonds that nations could share, forged by centuries of shared history, Christian faith, culture, heritage, language, ancestry, and the sacrifices our forefathers made together for the common civilization to which we have fallen heir.
Now let's dive deeper into how this wonderful Western civilization that Marco Rubio was articulating came about. He described Western civilization in a hierarchy, and they're at the top of that hierarchy, saying that they created law, science, religion, all of that came out of Europe. And it did not sound like non-white nations like Africa, Latin America, and Caribbean islands are going to be partners in this quest moving forward. It sounds more like Africa, Asia, Latin America will be territories to conquer, similar to those vast empires that Marco Rubio talked about so beautifully in the making of Western civilization. Before the Spanish, the British, the Portuguese charted off with its missionaries, its pilgrims, its soldiers and explorers in search of a new world to quote unquote settle upon, we have to talk about African history prior to its encounter with Western civilization. To keep it real short, there were thriving African empires who mastered the arts of science, medicine, culture, religion, law, philosophy, and spirituality throughout the continent. Please study the ancient empires of Ethiopia, Egypt, Ghana, Nigeria, Mali, Songhai, Benin, Zimbabwe, Rwanda, and the Zulu nation of South Africa, just to name a few. These Africans and their empires influenced the world, and many European scholars gave credit to this, like Diodorus, Herodotus, Count Constantine de Volney, Baron Denon, and even English scholar Joseph McCabe said this: Africa flourishing in these empires. And then around the 14th, 15th century, Africa as a continent was in a state of transition, trying to chart a new path. And then the interruption of the Europeans looking to expand and establish Western civilization. Our warrior scholar Walter Rodney summarizes the reasons for the conquest. When Europeans reached the Americas, they recognized the enormous potential of gold and silver and tropical produce. But that potential needed labor supplies. Indigenous Indian populations could not withstand new European diseases such as smallpox, and could not bear the organized toil of slave plantations and slave mines, having barely emerged from the hunting stage. That is why islands like Cuba and Hispaniola, local Indian populations were virtually wiped out by white invaders. Then Europe had a small population and could not afford to release the labor required to tap the wealth of the Americas. Then they turned to the nearest continent, Africa, which had the population accustomed to settled agriculture and disciplined labor in many spheres. Those were the objectives lying behind the start of the European slave trade, and while capitalist class in Europe used their control of international trade to ensure that Africa specialized in exporting slaves. And as Dr. Eric Williams articulated in Capitalism and Slavery, the reason for slavery was economical at first and not racial. The kind of benefits which Europe derived from its control of world commerce are fairly well known, although it's curious that the recognition of Africa's major contributions to European development is usually made in works devoted to specifically to that subject. While European scholars of Europe often treat the European economy as if it were entirely independent, like Marco Rubio mentioned in his speech. Europeans enslaved Africans for economic reasons, then used racism to justify the oppression and exploitation. European planter and miners enslaved Africans for economic reasons so that their labor power could be exploited. Indeed, it would have been impossible to open up the New World and to use it as a constant generator of wealth had it not been for African labor. European populations was too small and could not use the indigenous people. Western civilization was chiefly dependent on African labor. Dr. Eric Williams in Capitalism and Slavery summarizes. So what put the Europeans' mind at ease to carry out the most brutal and inhumane conquests in the modern world? This was all sanctioned from the religion in Europe that Marco Rubio was speaking so beautifully about in his speech. Dr. Eric Williams is quoted as saying, "The labor supply of low social status, docile and cheap, can be maintained in subjection only by systematic degradation and by deliberate efforts to suppress its intelligence." The systematic enslavement of people of African descent occurred to a large degree from a religious crusade conducted by organized religion out of Europe. The Catholic Church's support of black slavery was second only to the Muslim Arabs. The Catholic order not only justified black slavery, but was a major owner of slaves. In 1488, Pope Innocent VIII accepted a gift of 100 Moorish slaves from Spain and then distributed the slaves to various cardinals and nobles. In 1502, the Catholic Church worked closely with the Portuguese government, which had authorized the christening of black slaves before sending them to the colonies. In the 15th century, the Catholic Church in Europe issued several official decrees that provided the legal and moral framework for the enslavement of Africans. While some later popes issued condemnations of the unjust slavery, the church's early sanctions were the instrument in launching the transatlantic slave trade. Romanus Pontifex in 1455, also by the Pope Nicholas V, confirmed Portugal's exclusive rights to trade and conquest in West Africa and reaffirmed the permission to enslave non-Christians. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI divided the newly discovered lands between Spain and Portugal, extending the earlier sanctions of enslavement to the Americas. The military justification was the church argued that enslavement was a means to convert infidels to Christianity, supposedly saving their souls through forced labor. Then there was economic reliance. Various Catholic religious orders, most notably, were major slave owners or slave holders. By 1760, Catholics had owned over 2,000 enslaved people to support their missions and education institutions, such as Georgetown University. And the theological defense was the early theologians used the curse of Ham and St. Augustine's view of slavery as a consequence of sin to justify the institution. And the church did not issue a general condemnation of the institution of slavery until Pope Leo in 1888. And please don't think Africans just sat idly by and believed in this racist doctrine. Independent black church movement in Africa. Thousands of Christian Africans broke away from European churches and established their own places of worship from Protestants under Christian African leadership. Highly nationalistic, like John Chilembwe, who led the armed nationalist uprising in Malawi in 1917. And there were independent black church movements not just on the African continent. In the Americas, by the early 19th century, African Americans established independent black churches and congregations, often led by freedmen, such as the African Methodist Episcopal Church, founded by Richard Allen in 1816. These churches became the centers of resistance and community support, including being active in the Underground Railroad. And it was not just in the Americas. In the Caribbean, the Haitian Revolution from 1791 to 1804 was ignited by a religious revolt rooted in voodoo, which acted as a unifying force for enslaved people against French colonial rule. And in August of 1971, leaders like Dede Boukman and Cecil Fatiman held a pivotal ceremony initiating the uprising that burned the plantations and challenged slavery. This eventually led to the independence of Haiti. Dr. Claude Anderson in Black Labor, White Wealth helps us understand, while Africa's human capital was being displaced through slavery, so too were its natural and mineral wealth. Massive displacement of Africa's social and economic resources weakened West Africa's social and economic institutions. This doctrine of unequal exchange with the Western powers depleted Africa's resources, but the wealth and revenue generated from the commerce with Africa revived Europe's sagging economies. With surplus funds in their treasuries, European nations strengthened their military and commerce communities. In the 15th century, Europe began recovering from centuries of poverty, while Africa was increasingly exploited of its mineral wealth and its human capital. Through the centuries, Europeans espoused ethnocentric doctrines that encouraged a total and complete exploitation of Africa's natural resources and human wealth. And as we learn from Dr. Eric Williams in Capitalism and Slavery, Negro slaves were the strength and sinews of Western world. In 1718, William Wood said that the slave trade was the spring and parent whence the others flow. The first principle of foundation of all the rest, the mainspring of the machine which set every wheel in motion. Dr. Eric Williams describes the triangular slave trade in that the trade between England and France and colonial America supplied the exports and the ships. Africa, the human merchandise, the plantations, the colonial raw materials. The slave ships sailed from the home country with a cargo of manufactured goods. These were exchanged at a profit on the coast of Africa for Negroes who were traded on the plantations at another profit in exchange for cargo of a colonial produce back to the home country. The triangular trade thereby gave stimulus to the British industry. The Negroes were purchased with British manufacturing, transported to the plantations. They produced sugar, cotton, indigo, molasses, and other tropical products, the processes of which created new industries in England. The West Indian Islands became the hub of the British Empire, of immense importance to the grandeur and prosperity of England. It was the Negro slaves who made these sugar colonies the most precious colonies ever recorded in the whole annals of imperialism. It is said that the British Empire was a magnificent structure of American commerce and naval power on an African foundation. The profits obtained provided one of the main streams of that accumulation of capital in England which financed the Industrial Revolution. The bread colonies of Barbados, Jamaica, and Antigua fed the world on African labor. The development of the triangular trade and of shipping and shipbuilding led to the growth of the great seaports like Bristol, Liverpool, Glasgow in Europe. Occupied as seaports and trade centers, the position in the age of trade that Manchester, Birmingham, and Sheffield occupied later in the age of industry. The early 18th century England depended on the West Indian islands from between 2/3 to 3/4 of its raw cotton for linen goods, clothes. It made hats, caps, guns, powder, iron bars, copper kettles, glassware. All of these minerals was taken from these colonies to help enrich the Western powers. United States cotton, Cubans sugar, Brazil's cotton, sugar, and coffee. Economic relations between the island and the mainland in America were strengthened by individual contacts. West Indians owned property in the mainland. North Americans owned plantations in the islands. South Carolina was settled in Barbados. The Middletons, the Bulls, and the Coltons of South Carolina owned plantations in Jamaica and Barbados. Aaron Lopez, who was a Rhode Island slave trader, owned a sugar plantation in Antigua. Now, as we go back to the mainland United States, Dr. Claude teaches us that the northern economy also thrived off the labor of black people through profits from business connected to the slave industry. Northerners, directly or indirectly, supported slavery by enjoying the fruits of it by eating the food, wearing the cotton, and drinking the rum that black labor produced. Textile mills provided clothes, fabric, jobs, income, wealth, taxes, and other benefits to populations throughout the North. Black slaves produced the raw products for markets and in turn were a market for the finished products. Textile and leather industries tailored a major portion of their consumer items towards a captured market. Slavery institution. Beginning in Europe and spread throughout the New World, wealth produced by blacks fueled banking and industrial revolutions, generated new forms of government and economies, transferred massive amounts of wealth across racial, ethnic, and national boundaries, and fermented numerous civil wars. Black labor essentially fed, clothed, and enriched nations all around the world. Blacks have remained producers of wealth, but we have to be possessors of wealth. The United States government established and maintained preferential treatment laws, policies, and programs that gave and preserved wealth, power, and a privileged status for European whites. The government's preferential treatment programs and policies aggressively helped 16 generations of European whites to acquire free or cheap land, black labor, business and economic opportunities, and other forms of government assistance, while at the same time government supported laws and customs denied blacks access to the same resources and prohibited them from competing with whites in education, labor, professional trade, and businesses. Without government assistance, black enslavement would not have been possible. Without black slave labor to make the New World productive, land would have meant very little value, and the United States would not have been developed into an economic and military superpower. Much of the wealth was converted into corporate stocks, public bonds, and banking certificates, which were government regulated and protected. If we circle back to the continent, a great source of reading is Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And we must know, family, that Africans only became a slave when he reached a society where he worked as a slave. Before that, he was a free man and then a captive. Nevertheless, it is acceptable to speak of the trade in slaves when referring to the shipment of captives from African in various parts of the world where they lived and worked as property of Europeans. These ships were by Europeans to markets controlled by Europeans. This was the interests of European capitalism and nothing else. Europeans shipped Africans to European buyers. It was the European slave trade from Africa. The process by which captives were obtained on African soil was not a trade at all. It was through warfare, trickery, banditry, and kidnapping. It was through social violence. African labor was robbed because the Europeans took able-bodied Africans from the ages of 12 to 35. They always wanted the young, and they rarely took older Africans. The European slave trade was a direct block in removing millions of youth and young adults who were the human agents from whom inventiveness springs. Those who remained in areas badly hit by the slave capturing were preoccupied about their freedom rather than with improvements in production. The wealth created by African labor and from African resources was grabbed by the capitalist countries of Europe, these Western civilizations that Marco Rubio loves to talk about. The restriction placed upon African capacity to make the maximum use of its economic potential, which this is what development is all about. Western Europe strengthened its naval power and dominated with its vessels in the world's waterways. Europe's decision-making power was exercised in collecting what Africa should export in accordance to European goods. Europe exported Africa's goods, which were being produced and used in Europe, like your Dutch linen, your Spanish iron, your Portuguese wine, and your French brandy, and your German muskets. Central and South African gold and silver was mined by Africans, played a crucial role in meeting the need for coin and expanding capitalist money economy in Western Europe. It also helped Amsterdam in the 17th century become a financial capital of Europe. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries and most of the 19th century, the exploitation of Africa and its labor continued to be a source for the accumulation of capital to be reinvested in Western Europe. Our African contribution to European capitalists grown extensively over such vital sectors of shipping, insurance, the formation of companies, capitalist agriculture, technology, and the manufacturing of machinery. Africans were to dig the minerals out of the subsoil, grow the agricultural crops, collect natural products, and perform a number of odds and ends, such as bicycle repairing, as an example. Inside Europe, North America, workers would refine the minerals and the raw materials and make the bikes and sell them back to the Africans. They wanted Africans in a dependent state because if Africans could do this for themselves, they would no longer need Europe. The underlying connection is that capital seeks domination. It grows and spreads and seeks to get a hold of everything in sight. The exploitation of Africa gave European monopoly capital full opportunities to indulge in its tendencies for expansion and domination. An example of capitalism would be Firestone Rubber, who offered loans to the Liberian government for the control of its rubber. Between 1940 and 1965, Firestone took $160 million of rubber out of Liberia, while in return, Liberia only received $8 million. Zimbabwe has minerals like lithium, needed for the special steels that went into the new aircrafts, rockets, tanks, guns, and bombs. And let's be real, the colonial towns in Africa was not set up as some in industry, but it was administration towns for the colonizer to exploit the land and its people. The main purpose of colonial school systems was to train Africans to help man the local administration at the lowest ranks and to staff private capital firms owned by Europeans. It was not an educational system that grew out of the African environment, nor was it designed to promote rational use of material and social resources. It was not an educational system designed to give young people confidence and pride as members of African societies, but one which sought to instill a sense of deference towards all that was European and capitalist. Education in Europe was dominated by the capitalist class. Colonial schools was education for subordination, exploitation, and the creation of mental confusion and the development of underdevelopment. When capitalism had its impact on Africa in the colonial period, the idea of individualism was already in reactionary phase. It was no longer serving to liberate the majority, but rather enslave the majority for the benefit of a few. Kwame Nkrumah confirms this when he states in his work, "What I mean by positive action." We must remember that because of the educational backwardness of the colonial countries, the majority of the people of this country cannot read. There is only one thing that they understand, and that is action, which the word Kwame Nkrumah emphasized is action, which is a great segue to dispel another myth. Racism of Europe was a set of generalizations and assumptions which had no scientific basis, but were rationalized in every sphere from theology to biology. Our ancestors refused this notion of their inferiority and engaged in direct action for their liberation everywhere. Africans everywhere fought against alien political rule and had to be subdued by superior force. And as we reinforce forces, we have to understand that the docility of the Negro slave is a total myth. The Maroons of Jamaica and the Bush Negroes of the British Guyana were runaway slaves who had extracted treaties from the British government and lived independently in their mountain retreats. They were standing examples of the slaves of the British West Indies of one road to freedom. The successful slave revolt of Haiti was a landmark in the history of slavery in the New World. And after 1804, when the independent Republic of Haiti was established, every white slave owner in Jamaica, Cuba, or Texas lived in dread of another Toussaint L'Ouverture. The governor of Barbados once wrote, "The public mind is ever trembling alive of the dangers of any insurrection." And out of the estimated 35 to 50 million black people who were captured for shipment out of Africa, 2/3 never reached the slave markets. Most were killed resisting their captors or succumbed to the inhuman conditions of the slave ships. Some committed suicide. Contrary to the happy slave, many physically mutilated themselves in order to reduce their market value. Others died from new diseases, being overworked, or in unhealthy conditions. Some Africans would break tools, feign illnesses, run away, or just simply refuse to work. Some sought their freedom by setting fires to plantation buildings and the masters' houses. Many incidents of poisoning that many states passed laws prohibiting black people from working in or around drugstores. Crushing this lazy myth as well, the term would be a simple oxymoron. A lazy slave would have a very hard time surviving under the inhumane conditions of slavery, and America was making record profits from labor. White slave masters bragged about building a wealthy situation where they could devote its time to leisure, to study the art, the philosophy, and the finer things of life. So this should give great examples of not only were our ancestors not lazy, we fought back in so many incredible and creative ways. We fought on the continent to try to avoid slavery. We fought on the slave ships, and we fought when we got here. We fought against alien political rule and suppression all over this world and all throughout history, rejecting this Western civilization that Marco Rubio wants to sit up here and make everybody believe that it was created in such a humane and innocent way. We putting an end to these myths because we're going to teach our people how Western civilization has affected us, and not this rose-colored fairy tale picture that Marco Rubio was trying to paint on Valentine's Day in Germany.